Resume. Okay.
Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Thank you, everybody, for coming, for braving the inclement weather this morning. Thank you, those joining on Zoom.
And for fighting for seats.
Special shout out to Mark, who is back after his well-deserved trip. And we have our technical support back, so hopefully everything on the Zoom and the video and the audio should work well. Let me just mention, we are B'Shah Tova U'Mutzlachat beginning volume 17 this morning. We completed volume 16 last week. This is the second volume related to Hilchot Shabbat out of, I think, projected 7 or 8. Volume 18 is currently in preparation, and I'll just mention there are sponsorship opportunities. If anybody's interested sponsoring an entire volume or just one share or parts of a share, those opportunities are available, and you can speak to me after the share. Okay, so we are continuing with Hilchot Kiddush. Just before we get into the text, into the material, let me share with you an amazing Ktava Kabbalah that I saw just before Shabbat. In Parshat Shavua, Parshat Ki Tisa, so we have, it's one of the places, many places where the Torah repeats the mitzvah of Shabbat. And it uses a phrase which we find in other places as well. The Torah says, Achet Shabtotai Tishmoru, guard my Shabbatot. Now, that is an interesting phrase that it says, guard my Shabbatot. We would expect it to say it Shabbati, Tishmor. Why does it say Shabtotai in the plural? Okay, it's not talking about Sunday. So different explanations in the Rishonim. Why does it say Shabtotai, plural Shabbat? So there are those who say, today we have two different types of Shabbat. We have Shabbat and we have Yom Tov. We have Yom Kippur, and we know they have different restrictions, different laws, different aspects related to that. Maybe Shabtotai relates to both Shabbat in the sense of Shabbat and Shabbat in the sense of Yom Tov. Also does not relate to Shabbaton, the election day that we had last week. That's something else. But, says the Ktava Kabbalah, Shabtotai Tishmoru means Shabbat in the plural, because as we've discussed here many times, there are two different aspects of Shabbat. There is Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, and there is Shamor et Yom HaShabbat. We have the mitzvah of Shmirat Shabbat, which is the negative, the melachot, which are the things that you cannot do. But you also have the aspect of Schirat Shabbat, the positive aspect of Shabbat. So it says, the Ktava Kabbalah, he says that Shabbat is a dual aspect. There are two different Shabbatot that a person has to keep. There is Menuchata Guf, and there's Menuchata Nefesh. And it's not enough if we just keep Shmirat Shabbat. A person can Lishmol Shabbat. A person cannot do any melacha the entire Shabbat, refrain completely from doing the 39 melachot. The Ramban, that I've mentioned a number of times, talks about what would happen if a person didn't keep the Rabbanans of Shabbat. Says a person could have a situation in terms of Shmirat Shabbat, where a person doesn't do any melachot on Shabbat, but they have their shops open and they bring all their goods and they're doing all work and all sorts of things, where it's not Shabbat. You haven't done a single melacha, but you've transgressed. That's in one aspect. That's related to Shmirat Shabbat, but also Schirat Shabbat. How do we relate to Shabbat? What do our meals look like? What do the Divrei Torah look like? What are the Zmirot? What is the atmosphere that we create, the spiritual atmosphere that we create on Shabbat? It's not enough just to have that void of not doing melacha. You have to fill it with something. You have to fill it with something positive. So that is that says the Ktava Kabbalah. That is why it says Shabtotai Tishmor. You have to keep both Shabbatot.
But so they brought Schor Shabbat.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Zachor
Shabbat.
Zachor v'Shamor b'dibur echad. We have both, right? In Aseret HaDibrot, one place says Zachor, one place says Shamor.
Shabbat, not Shabtotai.
But that's what he says. That's the Shabtotai is both. There's the Zachor, there's the Shamor. This is what we can't do. Also, what we can do, we have to fill the Shabbat with content. Speaking of which, I'll just put in a plug. Very quickly, this Shabbat, we are filling with lots of tremendous content. Here in the shul, we have Rabbi Professor Avraham Steinberg coming. So if you've already booked for the dinner, then you can come. If you haven't booked for the dinner, it's sold out. So come for the lecture afterwards. And Shabbat morning, just mention after the Kiddush, there's going to be a Q&A session. You can still submit your questions. You have to pre-submit questions if you want them to be asked to Rabbi Steinberg. And I'll be moderating that session. But you can, after the share, send in your questions. Okay, so that is Shabtotai Tishmor. Now we know what the Shabbatot are referring to. Let's discuss how we can fill the Shabbat with that content. And one of the ways we do it is through the halachot of Kiddush. So we're in the book, volume 17. We're going to begin on page 21. So last week, we started talking about some of the halachot of Kiddush. We spoke about where the Kiddush of the night, today we'll get to Kiddush of the day as well, I hope. We spoke about how Kiddush of the night is, you have to click on view. whether it's a mitzvah d'oraita or mitzvah d'rabanan. We saw the most common understanding is that the obligation of Kiddush, which kicks in really once when Shabbat begins, there's an obligation to sanctify Shabbat. That is an obligation d'oraita. But Rabbanan came and said it has to be over a cup of wine. And we discussed the various applications and implications of that. We spoke about who says Kiddush as well. Okay, so now on page 21, while we're waiting for it to load.
Still blocks on him.
That we saw last week. That was in the. Yes. So the specific matbeh lashon, and we have this with many mitzvot. The specific words that we have to say, the formula, that is an institution of the sages, right? So again, we discussed, could it be technically, it might be that a person says Shabbat Shalom, that's enough on a Doraita level. I'll tell you where else this comes up. We're coming up, this week is Parashat Shkalim, soon we're going to have Parashat Zachor. So there's a mitzvah in the Torah of Zachor Tashat Amalek. We have to remember what Amalek did to us. Again, what does that mean? Remember what Amalek did. Are there specific words that you have to say? So Chachamim instituted that there are specific words that you have to say, which is Parshat Zachor, at a specific time during the year, which is the Shabbat before Purim, and that's when we say it, and that is how we fulfill that obligation d'oraita. Meaning, we find this many times that the Torah gave us an obligation, and Chachamim filled in the details of specifically how it is that it needs to be done. Okay. So in terms of who can say Kiddush and how we can hear Kiddush from others, mentioned last week as well, there are some families who have the custom where every male over the age of bar mitzvah will make their own Kiddush, right? Some people have that minhag. And many places, however, it's probably more common that just the Balabait says Kiddush on behalf of everybody. So source number one, is the Yesodei Yeshurun of Gedalia Felder, who's the more or less contemporary posek. So he addresses the following question. A question which we have nowadays in Medinat Yisrael, Kibbutz Galuyot. So we have all different people of all different edot and all different minhagim and all different ways of pronouncing things and maybe different formulas of saying Kiddush and saying certain tefillot. It's not exactly the same across every different edah. So what if you're a guest somewhere, or somebody, or you're in the army and somebody's going to say Kiddush on behalf of everybody? He's an Ashkenazi and I'm a Sephardi. Ashkenazi and he's a Sephardi, whatever it is, and they have a different way of pronouncing. Is that okay to hear a different pronunciation or a different nusach for Kiddush? So source number one says the following. It says, Dvar mevat'im v'avalot, mifta'im v'avalot, me'achenu b'nei Yisrael ba'im m'medinot shonot. We all come from different countries. We have different accents, different ways of pronouncing things. כמו מבטאי הספרדים היהודים, הפולנים, הליטאים, הונגרים ועוד. In bold. אם שליח ציבור הבא מפולניה, והמבטא שלו פולנית, מוציאו את יהודי ליטאי או הונגרי או להפך. Right, so you have one who has a Polish pronunciation and somebody else has a Lithuanian pronunciation. Okay, those are more or less similar. When one's Ashkenazi and one's Sephardi, it's going to be a lot more different. One's Temani. In any event, it says, כתב הגאון ראשון לציון, שאין בזה עתידו של תורת אמך, שזהו יסוד תורת המנהגים. Right, this is not considered the fact that I'm in shul and the shliach tzibur has a different pronunciation. That's not considered that I'm changing my minhag, and that is okay. He says now, קצת ראיה לזה מהש"ס. ברכת המזון ותפילה נאמרים בכל לשון, והתוספות כתבו, דיוצא ידי חובת קידוש. Okay, that's our sugya. Tosfot says, you can fulfill your obligation of קידוש, אף על פי שאינו מבין הלשון, ובכן במה יגרע מבטא אשכנזי לספרדי וכן הפכה. If the Gemara says, you could have said it in a different language, then surely if it's in a different accent, that is fine, that is no worse. And then he says that in the next paragraph as well. So we don't have to be concerned if somebody who's saying Kiddush says a slightly different nusach or slightly different pronunciation. So the way that I do, that is fine. Another case, interesting, and this is quite a practical case that comes up often, relating to Yom Tov. Yom Tov Sheni. On page 22 at the bottom, you'll see source number 2. This is a contemporary sefer called Yom Tov Sheni Hilchot. It's a very thick sefer, all the different permutations and halachot and every possible question you could think of relating to Yom Tov Sheni, Ben Chutlaris, Ben Israel. It's all in the sefer. So he discusses over there the following case. He says, Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galiot. It's now the second day of Yom Tov. So if I live in Chutlaretz, right, if I haven't yet made Aliyah and I live in Chutlaretz, then one would be obligated in Yom Tov Sheni. What if an Israeli is visiting there? Can they make Kiddush for the person in Chutz La'aretz on the second day, or vice versa? So he says, Yom Tov Sheni shel Galiot, al yekadesh b'layla o b'yom ben Eretz Yisrael kedei lotzi ben Chutz La'aretz yodei chovat Kiddush. That is a situation where the Ben Eretz Yisrael, who is not obligated in the second day of Yom Tov. I'm not now talking about refraining from doing malacha, certainly not in public, if you're in Chutz La'aretz, but intrinsically, if I live in Eretz Yisrael, my Ben Eretz Yisrael, the second day of Yom Tov, I'm not obligated in, and therefore I cannot make Kiddush for somebody who needs to hear Kiddush on that day. Okay, that's an interesting point. Kiddush during the day is probably the Rabbanan everywhere, even on Shabbos. But what's your question?
No, so I'm saying that the Rabbanan, maybe I'm not commanded to do it, maybe I could stand in for it.
No, so once it's, again, we say that only if you are obligated in something can you fulfill somebody else's obligation. That's the Rabbanan, all right? Related to the sugya we discussed last week a bit, yeah.
Understand the words they're saying in that accent. The Hasidic accent, I really have trouble. I don't know what word that was.
Okay, so the question was asked, what if somebody's saying in a different accent and you're not sure? So I would say like this, so long as you know what they're saying, what they're meant to be saying, you know that they're saying Kiddush, and you can hear them, even if you can't understand the word, then that would be sufficient. In the same way that we say, when it comes to Tefillah, by the way, when it comes to Kriyat Shema, when it comes to Tefillah, all sorts of things, we say, generally speaking, we daven in Hebrew. That's the language of the Siddur. That's the way it should be. The Gemara does say that you could daven in any language. Okay, it's a little bit complicated, especially for Kriyat Shema. We don't rely on it because we don't know the exact translation of all the words. How do you say Totafot in English? Exactly, right? So we don't know the translation of all the words. That's why we don't do it. But the condition is, the Gemara says, if one was to daven in another language that is not Hebrew, then the condition is you need to understand what you're saying. If you're davening in Hebrew, always better to understand, but it's Lashon HaKodesh, so even if you don't understand, you still fulfill your obligation. Okay. Another question that comes up, and this also is a very common, very contemporary. What happens if somebody, and maybe, this can come up in the army, this can come up in many places, but somebody who is not Shomer Shabbat is saying Kiddush. Can I fulfill my obligation of Kiddush from somebody who themselves is not a Shomer Shabbat? So source number 3, Shut Or LeTzion of Ben Zion Abba Shaul, the Rosh Yeshiva of Porat Yosef, late Rosh Yeshiva of Porat Yosef, right? He says, "Ha'im efshar latzit yedei chova b'kiddush sheshomer mimachalel Shabbat." So he's quite stringent on this. He says, "Ein yotzim yedei chova b'kiddush sheshomim mimachalel Shabbat, u'mi she'ezdamen lemakom she'no yachol hakadesh al hayayin levado yekadesh b'tzinaa al hapat." Okay, so he says you would not fulfill your obligation. I'll explain now in a moment precisely who and what the case he's talking about. But he says if one is in such a scenario, we obviously don't want to embarrass the person. So he says if you're standing there and the person, you're not going to fulfill your obligation through Kiddush, you could say Kiddush quietly over the bread. We'll get to that a little bit later in terms of if a person doesn't have wine, how do we say Kiddush over bread, etc. But what's behind this? What's behind this idea? So we know in the Gemara, there is a concept of a Mechalel Shabbat B'far Hesed. The truth is, these sources are discussed in far greater detail. I think it's in Sharon, volume 5. There's a whole discussion over there in terms of wines and in terms of the status of, in our days, of a Mechalel Shabbat B'far Hesed. But essentially, we can understand the logic that if Kiddush, by nature, is we are giving testimony to the creation of the world, we're giving testimony to the fact that Hashem created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, whatever that means in a metaphorical sense. But somebody who themselves does not keep Shabbat, does not follow that testimony, it seems a little bit strange that person could be making Kiddush. And therefore, the Or LeTzion, Ben Zion Abba Shaul says, you cannot fulfill the mitzvah in that way. However,
it's perfectly reasonable for someone to accept that God created the world without accepting any of the, kashrut, shmirat Shabbat, all those stuff, but they accept the concept that Hashem created the world.
So this is exactly the question. This is exactly the question. How far do we take this, and how do we consider? Can you say, right? If we say the person accepts maybe the fact that they are standing and they're not keeping Shabbat, But the fact that they are standing and making Kiddush on Shabbat, that is enough. They're saying, I believe in Kiddush. I believe in the concept of Shabbat. I believe in the concept that I'm giving testimony that God created the world. Okay, I think you know what? I think you rabbis have gone a little bit too far. I think these 39 melachot, all these details, all these. That's not for me. That's not for me. But the concept of I'm standing at the very fact I'm standing here and making Kiddush. If I didn't believe in it at all, I wouldn't stand here and I wouldn't make Kiddush. So maybe that's enough. So there are many poskim who say, especially nowadays, right, when many people, it's once upon a time, when the Gemara talks about it, Machalel Shabbat Ufarhesia, when you were living in a society when 99.9% of Jewish people, or in your society at least, were keeping Shabbat, and somebody wasn't doing it, it was a statement. The fact is that I'm not keeping Shabbat as a statement of rebellion. Nowadays, most people out there in the street, Chiloni, whatever, it's not as a statement of rebellion. It's the way that they grew up. It's what they know from their environment. They think that this, they see it as something political. They see it, whatever reason. So there is far more room to be lenient with this, and many poskim will go along with that. Have a look at source number 4, Rav Eliezer Melamed. So he was asked the following question. This is on the internet on Atar Yeshiva. He was asked the following question. He says, Anina Allah bat 16. Lifnei shana chazarti b'tshuva. So a 16-year-old girl who is chozelet b'tshuva, v'holai mechabdim et alki. Okay, her parents are respectful of her. Her parents are themselves not observant, but they are respectful of her decision. This happens many times. This is the way it happens. The girl has started to take on more observance, and the parents are starting to keep kosher, starting to make Kiddush at home on a Friday night. So the father does not keep Shabbat. But he's not observant, but he's going to make Kiddush in the house. So she wants to know, can she fulfill her mitzvah of Kiddush through the Kiddush that he says? And Rav Melamed says yes. He says, Kevan she'avicha mechabed et haShabbat v'rotze lasot Kiddush. The fact is, he's standing and making Kiddush. That itself is a statement of respect, a statement of understanding what Shabbat is all about, and therefore, okay, there is more to talk about. There are more sources over here. Footnote number 5. Again, one of the sources this relies on is the Binyan Sion, which is quoted here in footnote number 5. And there's more to discuss further on page 53 at the end. But generally speaking, again, these kind of questions should, that can be very, very sensitive and should be addressed on a case-by-case basis. But essentially what we've seen here is that there is great room to suggest that even if somebody themselves is not observant, so long as it's not as a rebellious statement, the fact that they come and the fact they make Kiddush, that is something that we can rely on, and one could fulfill their obligation in that way many, many times. Okay. Now that we know who makes Kiddush, the question is, when should they make Kiddush? Over the page number 24, the proper time. Again, we're still talking about Kiddush at night.
This is a question for somebody's Mechal Shabbat to make Kiddush,
yes,
be to somebody else. But is it easier to say that he can make Kiddush for himself and be Yotze?
Yeah. There is maybe a discussion, but I would think that if a person for themselves is okay, the question is for others. Okay. So page number 24, the Tur in source number 5 says the following: when you come home from shul on Friday night, you have to hurry up and eat straight away. Okay. Remember what we said last week? Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. When is the obligation to make Kiddush? When Shabbat comes in, b'knisato. Not 3 hours later, not right. Straight away, you come home and you make Kiddush. Some places have there's some households where they have, might be 7 o'clock is when we eat dinner. Every night at 7 o'clock we eat dinner. So especially in Chutlar, so there sometimes in the winter Shabbat comes in 3:30 in the afternoon, whatever it is. You come up, no, you have to wait till 7 o'clock. Says the Torah, we shouldn't do that. Okay, you should come home and you should eat straight away. It doesn't mean, this is not, by the way, it doesn't mean like when we light Hanukkah candles. And it has to be in that half an hour after Shkia, looking at the clock. It shouldn't be in a way, in general, it shouldn't be stressful. It shouldn't be, we have to go. So much of Shabbat, we've seen Shabbat candles and things, about Shalom Bayit, about not embarrassing the Chalas. We've discussed all these things. If a person's going to come home and going to say, we have to eat now, right away. What about Shalom Bayit? Okay, that's not the way it is. But it's saying in general, come home, you don't need to have a stopwatch. but you should come home and you should eat straight. You shouldn't delay and get involved in other activities first. That's the point. Says the Shulchan Aruch, "She'avo leveito yemahel echol miyad." Come home, hasten, eat straight away. Says the Mishnah Berurah, source number 7. Before that, you can see just in the between, says Rav Yitzchak Yosef adds, one should also not delay coming home by talking to others. Okay, so source number 7, he says the Mishnah Berurah, okay, if a person isn't hungry, you don't want to eat, especially in the winter, Shabbat comes very early. You don't want to eat straight away. You want to wait a little bit. That's okay. We have seen before, I think the very first shir we did on Hilchot Shabbat, this is part of the reason, a person shouldn't have a big meal late on Friday afternoon or even early on Friday afternoon if that means you won't be hungry Friday night. But he says you don't have to have straight away if you're ready, you're not hungry. Now he says why? Again, because the mitzvah of Kiddush is b'knisato, at the onset of Shabbat. It says the Mishnah Berurah, kvar zachar et Shabbat b'tfilato beit hakneset, v'yotzei b'zeh mitzvat aseido, ha'eta l'Rambam b'kedil kaman. As we discussed last week, you've already fulfilled your Doraita obligation of Kiddush when you daven. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the technicalities now. We discussed that previously. Mikol makom, nonetheless, says the Mishnah Berurah, Nileh. I'm now reading in bold in source number 7. The heicha the yesh b'zeh mishum shalom bayit. If it's related to shalom bayit, or sheyesh lo b'beito meshartim or shal orchim u'bipat orach ani lo yacher. You have people that are serving in their home, or you have guests, especially if it's a poor guest who hasn't eaten all week and he's going to be very, very hungry. There's a famous story of the Chafetz Chaim, right? That once that the Chafetz Chaim came home and skipped Shalom Aleichem, skipped Eshet Chayil, the whole thing, made Kiddush straight away. They said to him, what's going on? What happened? What about Shalom Aleichem? What about that? And he said, we have poor guests who've come, who haven't eaten, who are very hungry. He says the Malachim can wait, but they're waiting to eat. We have to make sure we have Kiddush and allow them to start eating. So if you have people that are hungry, so you shouldn't delay. You should make Kiddush as soon as you can. Okay, so you want to wait till you're hungry. Don't allow that to come at the expense of others. That's what the Chafetz Chaim says here in source number 7, very characteristic. We did discuss, and in a few weeks' time, it's going to become relevant once again when we get into the summer and we start making early Shabbat. So we discussed previously how that is allowed. What does Tosefet Shabbat mean? How can one pray before nightfall? What about eating before nightfall? Right? I refer you to volume 16. But over here we have the Gemara in Brachot, source number 8. It's the Gemara that we saw that said Rav Tzali shel Shabbat be'erev Shabbat. This is the source for making early Shabbat, that Rav would daven the tefillah of Shabbat on Erev Shabbat. In other words, on Friday before nightfall, Rav would daven Kabbalat Shabbat and Mariv. Question is, if you can daven Kabbalat Shabbat and Mariv before nightfall, can you also make Kiddush before nightfall? And if you'll tell me, well, what's the point if you can't do it earlier? Well, you could still do it earlier and make Kiddush as soon as it gets dark. You could still save time. But in any event, so the question is, Omer Kedusha Lakos or Eino Omer Kedusha Lakos? That is the Gemara's question. Can you say Kiddush over the cup or not? It says here Kedusha Lakos, because of course we've already said Kedusha in Tefillah, that he says you can say earlier. So Tashma, Tamar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel, מתפלל אדם של שבת בערב שבת, ואומר קדושה לכוס, והלכתה כבתי. Conclusion of the Gemara is yes, in the same way that you can, if you can daven earlier before nightfall, you can also say Kiddush before nightfall. The Magen Avraham here says that you could actually do the whole thing a different way around. He says, Nirali, Dimrotzeh lekabel Shabbat mibod yom lukadesh, v'le'echol, v'litpalel alvit b'layla l'shai. This is not so common. We'll see in a moment why it's not so common. But the Magen Avraham says, theoretically, if one wanted to accept Shabbat early, while it's still day, say Kiddush and have your meal, and then go and daven, he says you could do that. And now the reason, by the way, the reason why we wouldn't have a meal before we daven is because when we get to half an hour of the time before Kriyat Shema, that's when you're not supposed to start having a meal, start doing activities that are going to take a long time, and you may not interrupt and you may not stop and say Shema. So if it's more than half an hour before nightfall, that is the time when you would be permitted to do this. So that's talking about if you're eating on, here we're talking about your Shabbos meal. If you eat a large meal on Friday, right, which is before you accept Shabbat, that is problematic.
Yes.
But
No.
yeah, what's he talking about? He's saying you want to accept early Shabbat. So although it's still day outside, it's Shabbat because I've accepted. So if the person wants to accept Shabbat on Friday afternoon after Plaga Mincha, obviously, make Kiddush, eat, and then go and daven Maariv after you've already had your Sudat Shabbat. The Magen Abraham thinks that's okay. Like Adnarot would precede this, sure, because once you say Kiddush, you're accepting Shabbat. However, the Vilna Gaon does not approve. Vilna Gaon source number 10, which is Maaseh Rav. He says like that Maaseh Rav is the sefer, which is the things with the practices and the customs of the Vilna Gaon, based on the things that he would. It's not a sefer that he wrote, but they went around and they followed the Rebbe and they said they saw he did this, they saw he davens, he says this, he does it this way. So they collected all these practices, put it in a book. Rav Chaim of Volozhin, who was the Talmud Muvak of the Gra, said that nearly everything in Maaseh Rav is accurate. I think there was maybe 3 things he said which were not accurate. This is not one of them. So he says, Shamati b'shem Agon HaChasid Shama, שזה אינו נכון מדברים בברכות רב צלי של שבת, תשמע רב נחמן המשמע וכולי, bold, source number 10, משמע, דווקא כשמתפלל תחילה, אז יכול לקדש מבעוד יום. Says the Gra, no. It's only if you've davened first on Friday afternoon that then you can now say Kiddush. You can't reverse the order. כשאינו מתפלל, אינו יכול לקדש. He rejects that. Okay, and again, I think the common practice, I've never seen it where people go and make Kiddush and then have their Sudat Shabbat and then daven Maariv. Very common to you have early Shabbat. We do it here throughout the summer. But you come to shul, you daven first, you walk home, even though it's still light outside. But you've accepted Shabbat, you've done it like at Nerot, and you make your Kiddush and you eat. We did mention that there is an opinion that one should still have a kazait of bread after nightfall. Okay, not everybody holds that is a requirement. There are those who are stringent for that. That is an opinion that exists, but there is not one that all say is required. Okay. If somebody, for whatever reason, did not say Kiddush on Friday night, okay, this sometimes happens. We mentioned the Chayalim. Sometimes story in Yeshiva once where a Chayal came back from fighting or from being in the army, very, very tired, comes back, has a little bit of a rest on Friday afternoon. Next thing you know, he wakes up and it's already Shabbat morning. So he's missed Friday. That was the good version. There's another version of these stories where he wakes up and it's already Motzei Shabbat. But that's but for whatever reason, or a person was sick or a person fell asleep, whatever, they didn't say Kiddush on Friday night. So then, if you've not said your Kiddush on Friday night, you would have to say Kiddush on Shabbat morning, meaning we'll get to Kiddush of the day, but Kiddush of the day is different. But Kiddush of the day, by the way, if you think about it, what do we say for Kiddush of the day? In the morning, we say Borei Pri Hagafen, which is the bracha you say before you drink wine. There's no other bracha. Okay, there are psukim that we say, different minhagim. Do you need to say those psukim? Not need to say those psukim. We'll get to that. But the bracha on Friday night, so you say Vayachulu. The paragraph of Vayachulu, by the way, you would only say on Friday night. So if a person missed Kiddush on Friday night for whatever reason, they would have to repeat it in the morning. They would not say Vayachulu again. But they would say there are 2 brachot. Right? There's the bracha of Borei Pri Hagafen. There's also the bracha of Mekadesh Shabbat. Did he also miss Maariv? Yes, he missed Maariv as well. Okay, so then he would go and he would have to say Kiddush during the day. That's the Gemara in source number 11 says that. Shulchan Aruch number 12 says Im lo Kiddush balayla ben b'shogeg ben b'mezid, whether it was inadvertent or it was deliberate. Nonetheless, yesh lo tashlumin machar kol hayom. You have tashlumin for Kiddush, so to speak. You can make it up. You have to make it up during the day. Says the Rama Omer kol Kiddush halayla milvad vayachulu. Vayachulu is part of the night, so you don't say that, but the rest of Kiddush you would have to say. So source number 13 is the Aruch HaShulchan, and that's what he says. Nereh, Tikshemekadesh lemachar yotze gam beKiddush shel yom. You don't now need to say Kiddush twice during the day. You would say it once, but you would just say the formula of the night, and that would be in place of both Kiddushim, essentially. You're asking about tefillah. That's a different. So that's a different question. No. So again, we've discussed in volume 16 as well. But tashlumin, when it comes to tefillah, the halacha is always if a person missed a certain tefillah, you have the opportunity for tashlumin at the next consecutive tefillah, but whatever that tefillah is, you'll say that twice. And that is in lieu of the one that's before. We don't change the word. It's the same thing we've mentioned before, Rosh Chodesh, right? If a person missed Rosh Chodesh davening on Mincha, forgot to say Yaleh V'Yavo, and now the following evening is no longer Rosh Chodesh, you would daven Mariv twice. You also wouldn't say Yaleh V'Yavo, but you daven twice in place of, that's how Tashlumin generally works. Question?
Okay, so you say 2 brachas from Friday night, and then go into the Shamru.
No, so you don't have to say the formula of the day. That's what we said. You would just say the Kiddush from the night, and that would be sufficient for the Kiddush of night and day. We're going to get to Kiddush of the day now. But again, this is a very hopefully uncommon case. Generally speaking, say your Kiddush on Friday night, say your Kiddush on Shabbos day, and everything will be good. Okay, so let's talk about Kiddush of Shabbat day. We're on page 28. The Gemara over here, Gemara Pesachim. A lot of the halachot of Kiddush we learn from the Gemara in the last chapter of Pesachim. Says the Gemara like this: Eini ela balayla bayom minayin tamud lomar zachor et yom haShabbat. So from the fact that the pasuk says zachor et yom haShabbat, right? Last week when we were talking about Kiddush Hayom, I kept stressing that whenever the poskim talk about Kiddush Hayom, they don't mean during the day versus the night. They mean Kiddush of Yom HaShabbat. But when we have specifically the word Yom, it says Yom HaShabbat, so the Gemara understands that it's relating to the day, not necessarily the night. Now again, most poskim understand, you see this is a pasuk. So you'll tell me it's learned from a pasuk, it's a chova d'oraita. No, the understanding here is that this is more of an asmachta, and that this is still, it's going to be a din d'Rabbanan of Kiddush during the day. It's interesting is that the Gemara calls the Kiddush of the day Kiddush HaRabbah. Kiddush HaRabbah means the great Kiddush. So if I ask you which is more important, right, the small Kiddush or the great Kiddush, you'll tell me the great Kiddush, Kiddush HaRabbah. Which is more important, Kiddush of the night or Kiddush of the day? From the language, you'll think Kiddush of the day. But it's actually not the case. Kiddush of the night is more important, right? The Chovah d'Oraita of Kiddush, which is already before I have a cup of wine, but that's B'Knisato, that's at night. Nonetheless, Chachamim added on Kiddush during the day. Why did they call it Kiddush HaRabbah? So says source number 15, says the Tosfot Rid, that it's a bit of a euphemism. He says, Kiddush HaRabbah Pilush, Mishum Zutar. This is actually the minor Kiddush. This is less significant. And therefore, Kariyale Kiddush HaRabbah, it's a respectful way. It's a euphemism. We find this in other places. B'derech kavod, in order to give it honor. People are just going to say, Kiddush. Everybody knows Kiddush at night is the really important one. Kiddush the day, it's just the Rabbanan. Rabbis think, right? No, so therefore they call it Kiddush HaRabbah, so people would treat it with respect. And he says, we see in different places in the Gemara, we use these euphemisms. For example, K'mo she'arim l'suma sagin nahor. How does the Gemara talk about somebody who can't see? It's called a sagin nahor, one who has abundant light. Again, it's a euphemistic way of speaking. And therefore he says, Kiddush HaRabbah, sorry, we're on top of page 29. That's how he calls, that's why we call it Kiddush HaRabbah. I saw another, an explanation. I saw Rav Rimon's Sefer on Shabbat. He suggested the following idea as well. He says Kiddush HaRabbah maybe relates not just to the Kiddush, but relates to Shabbat. In other words, when Shabbat begins, so just begin, you sort of, you're still running in, you've just put everything down, you stop working, you're running in at the last minute, you begin Shabbat, okay, but you're still tired from cooking or whatever. You have Friday night, you have your Shabbat meal, you absorb some of the Kedusha of Shabbat, right? Tefillah in the morning, you come home, you've already had half of Shabbat. You can sense, now in a sense, it's you've absorbed, you soaked in some of that Kedusha. Now is in a time that we can be ready and we can comprehend the greatness of Shabbat in a level that we weren't maybe able to at the beginning, and that might be hinted at when it says Kiddush HaRabbah as well. Is the Kiddush of the day similar in terms of its halachot and in terms of its requirements to the Kiddush of night? So the Rambam, here in source number 16, the Rambam towards the end of Hilchot Shabbat, he says yes, and he says therefore many halachot that we have, like not eating before Kiddush, like Kiddush b'makom Suda as well. Kiddush b'makom Suda we'll talk about next week or the week after, whenever we get there. Very, very important discussion in terms of the fact that you cannot have Kiddush without having your meal, and what is considered a meal, where do you have the meal, where do you make Kiddush? Okay, we'll get to there as well. But the Rambam says in number 16 like this: Mitzvah levarech al hayayin b'yom haShabbat kodem she'isod suda shniya. So this is the mitzvah of Kiddush. You say Brei Pri Hagafen before you have your meal. V'zeu hanekra Kiddush harab. Mevarech Brei Pri Hagafen bilvad v'shoteh. So notice, what is Kiddush? Says the Rambam. You say Brei Pri Hagafen and you drink. That is, by the way, that's the bottom line. The Kiddush of night has a formula that has to be said because it has the brachot. The Kiddush of the day, okay, we say the psukim before, and there are different customs. Which psukim do you say? Some people start from Im Tashiv, some start from Vishamru, some say Mizmor David, right? All different customs in terms of what is said. But strictly speaking, the Kiddush of the day is Borei Pri Hagafen. So if a person didn't say anything, all they did was they picked up a cup of wine and said, Baruch Adonai Hashem HaChalam, Brei Pri Hagafen, they fulfilled their mitzvah of Kiddush during the day. Okay, it's less ceremonial, it's less whatever. A person should obviously follow their minhag, but in extenuating circumstances, maybe in the army, maybe if a person doesn't know, can't remember, just say Brei Pri Hagafen, you fulfilled the obligation during the day. Night, it's different. But he says, so you say Kiddush, afterwards, you wash your hands, you have your meal. Now, in bold. A person cannot eat before making Kiddush, same as at night. And this Kiddush has to be only in the place of the meal. In other words, says the Rambam, the same halachot that apply to the night Kiddush apply to the daytime Kiddush. The Ravid, who was the Bar Plukta of the Rambam, we have in the Rambam, in every, just about every copy of the Mishnah Torah, so you have printed next to the halachot of the Rambam, you have the hasagot of the Ravid. And the Ravid quotes in places where he disagrees with the Rambam. And you'll see the language over here. The way the Rishonim, when they argued with each other, wait, did they argue? You know, if we heard somebody spoke that way about the Rambam today, and we kicked them out of the Midrash. We wouldn't allow it. But this is what the Ravid says. Listen to this. He says, says the Ravid, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That's what he says. Okay, like I say, nowadays this is the real Ritcha Doraita, right? This is why Chachamim argue with each other. Obviously, they respected each other very much. The problem is today, when people talk that way, they don't respect each other at all. But he says like this: He says, okay, Rambam, with all due respect, because it's called Kiddush al-Rabba, so you think it's the same as the Kiddush of night? No, we said that's just a name, it's just a euphemism. Chachamim said that we have to, in the morning, we have to say Kiddush as well, to make it distinct. Maybe it's a reminiscence of the night, for whatever reason. But, you've already fulfilled your mitzvah of Kiddush in the night. Okay, and the fact you're going to say that there's a restriction on eating before you've had Kiddush, that applies to the night. In other words, says the Ravid, yes, Chachamim said you have to say Brei Pri Hagafen in the morning, I agree. But to now tell me that I can't eat anything before I make Kiddush, and to tell me it's only Kiddush from Makom Suda, the Ravid disagrees with the Rambam. Now we paskin like the Rambam. We paskin like the Rambam on this. But I'll tell you where there is a very great nafkamina between this, where perhaps we do rely on the opinion of the Ravid. Okay? I mentioned before that there is a halakha, which we'll discuss later, of Kiddush b'makom Suda. That when we only fulfill our obligation of Kiddush when we eat our meal as well. Okay? If a person comes and says, Brei Pri Hagafen, that's why last week I think we discussed, if the Chazan says, here it's not our minhag, in Eretz Yisrael it's not so common, but in Chutz La'aretz it's very common still, where the Chazan will say Kiddush in Shul as part of davening. So the Chazan says Kiddush in Shul as part of davening. That is not Kiddush b'makom Suda. You just have the wine and you're not eating anything. So he has not fulfilled his obligation of Kiddush. He has to go home and make Kiddush again. What do we do with the wine? So we discussed this whole thing. Maybe the Chazan can drink a little bit. Maybe you give to a young child to drink. Whatever you do. Now, generally speaking, how do we define a Suda? We define a Suda with bread. We make hamotzi, we wash and we eat. Very, very prevalent minhag in Am Yisrael is that you have a Kiddush in Shul on Shabbat morning after davening, right? You have a Kiddush. That's what we do here every Shabbat. Mefarchim in your book. But think about this. You make Kiddush, and then you start eating. You don't eat bread. You don't wash. There are places where they do, we actually had it in my shul in England, and many places in Chutz La'aretz, especially in the winter, where the day is very, very short. And it's almost impossible to have Seudah Shlishit. I remember in the winter in London, you'd, shul there only starts at 9:30. By the time you finish, it's 12:30. You have the Kiddush, you get home. By the time you start eating, it's 2:00. By the time you finish eating, at 3:00, you have to be back for Mincha. And that's, so you're rushing before. So there's literally no time for Seudah Shlishit. So there we used to have rolls at the Kiddush, and you can wash, and then the Kiddush is your Seudah Shniyah, and then you have lunch, which is actually Seudah Shlishit. Okay, and everything works out flavor. But generally speaking, it's more common. We don't wash for the Kiddush. You go home, you have a bit of mezonot, you have a bit of cholent, a bit of kugel, whatever it is. So that's not a Seudah. Is that Kiddush Makom Seudah? So we rely there on the opinion that mezonot is considered a Seudah. Not everybody relies on it, by the way. There are people who will only have Kiddush and will only eat if they're washing and having bread, because that is a Seudah. But we rely on the opinion that it is a Seudah if we have mezonot. Now, it's much more prevalent to rely on that in the morning. It's much less common. There are shuls that do it. We'll have on a Friday night, we'll have a chicken soup Kiddush or whatever it is, but it's much, much less common. Generally speaking, Friday night, we say we have make Kiddush, and we'll go home and we'll make Kiddush, and then we'll have our meal. So Rav Shechter explained this to me once the following way. He said it's based on the fact that we have a sveika. We have two sveikot. We say in the morning, the custom is that we can make Kiddush, and we cannot have bread. We'll eat mezonot, and we'll rely on that for Kiddush Makom Seudah. Why? Because it's a combination of two factors. One factor is maybe Makom Seudah, as we'll discuss later on, is mezonot. Maybe that's enough. But also, maybe halacha follows the Ravid, that in the morning you don't need Kiddush Makom Seudah. So bring those two factors together. I don't need to have the Kiddush of the day doesn't need to be Makom Seudah, and Makom Seudah might be mezonot. That's enough, and then we can rely on. On Friday night, I only have one of those factors. On Friday night, nobody says what the Ravid says is only in the day. Friday night, I say Kiddush has to be b'makom Seudah. So then you'll say maybe mezonot is, maybe it isn't. So that's not enough. So if there are places that rely on it, but it's less. So that is a nafkamina maybe that comes out of discussion between the Rambam and the Ravid. Again, the basic halacha is we follow the Rambam. That also for Kiddush during the day needs to be b'makom Seudah. What I'm saying is, with other mitigating factors and other things that come into it, so the Ravid could possibly be a consideration. Yeah. Yeah.
When people come wash if they choose.
Yeah.
But there's no chair, no table for anybody. Does that still count if you're standing up as a Seudah?
Yeah, so it still counts. So the truth is that takes us to a separate area of halacha. There's a question in general: if a person is eating a bread meal, then should a person be standing? Is that the proper way to do it? The Gemara actually says that people who sit and eat out on the street might be pasul le'idut. Obviously, we have to understand the sociological context in which that is talking and what that represented. I'm not saying that nowadays people go and sit and eat in a falafel shop. They're still kasher le'idut. Don't worry, that's okay. Generally speaking, yes, if one's having a proper meal, one should be sitting down, one should be eating. But if circumstances dictate and whatever, certainly for this halacha of Kiddush Makom Seudah, there's no way to sit. You stand, you have your roll. That's okay. You would still fulfill your obligation in that way. Okay. Next topic. We're talking about Makom Seudah. What if a person does not have wine? What if a person does not have wine, and how would one make Kiddush before that? Yeah.
Before we using schnapps, is it?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. Yeah. So, if a person doesn't have wine, could one make Kiddush nonetheless? And would it be better to use challah or to use another beverage, another alcoholic beverage or something like that? So the Gemara in Psachim, source number 18 on page 30, says the following: "To the Marav Bruna Marav, Hanotel Yadav Lo Yekadesh." That if a person has already washed his hands, to say Kiddush after washing hands would constitute a hefsek between washing and eating. Amalu Rav Yitzchak Bashmon Bar Malta, Akati Lo Nachnafshe Derav Shchachninu Lishmatatet. Okay, so very interesting narrative here in this Gemara. The Gemara first quotes a statement from Rav. It seems to be that this was said after Rav had already passed away. Rav Brunner was quoting his teacher, but Rav wasn't there. So the Gemara says Rav Yitzchak, it hasn't been a long time since Rav has passed away, and we've already forgotten what he said. We've already forgotten. That's not what he meant. It's not what he meant. He says, sometimes we would go and we would be by Rav on Shabbat. Zimnin de chaviva alei lifta, mekadesh lifta. Zimnin de chaviva alei chamla, mekadesh chamla. Okay, so we'll get to the other beverages either later on or maybe only next week. But right now we're talking about between the bread and the wine. And the question is whether you can wash first and then you can make your kiddush, or you can make kiddush over the bread and not over the wine, etc. So what the Gemara here says, now there's a big machloket rishonim how to understand this Gemara. What it sounds like it's saying, a simple language, zimnin dechaviva alei lifta, mekadesh lifta, zimnin dechaviva alei chamla, mekadesh chamla. Meaning, Rav sometimes would make kiddush over bread, and sometimes he would make kiddush over wine, depending on what was more chaviv, what he preferred at that point. We've spoken before on Tu B'Shvat, where we had our big fruit platters, and we had a big question: which fruit do you make the bracha on first? Right. So there are those who say, the Shulchan Aruch paskins, that you first take a fruit from the Shiva Minim. But let's say you don't have a fruit from the Shiva Minim. Right? So then all the Rambam says, even if you have fruit from the Shiva Minim, so you could say the bracha first on the fruit which is chaviv. That which you prefer more, that's the one you take, and that's the one you say the bracha on. If a person, generally speaking, person has two different foods in front of them, which have the same bracha, both are shakol, or both are ha'etz, or both are adama, or both are mezunot, which one should you pick up and say the bracha on? One bracha will cover both foods. But which one do you take? You take the one which is chaviv, the one which you like more. Okay. What happens if today I'm in the mood for an apple, but next week I'm in the mood for an orange? Okay. So whichever one it is, that's at that time, that's called chaviv. That's what. So he says, Rav, when he was more wanted the bread, he would make kiddush over the bread. When he wanted the wine, he would make kiddush over the wine. Okay. That's how the Rashbam understands the Gemara. Okay. So which is sounds a little bit strange. Sometimes you make kiddush over wine, sometimes over bread. Okay. Tosfot understands here differently. Tosfot understands Rabbeinu Tam in source number 19. If we can just scroll down on the computer, source number 19. So he says, Mekadesh al-lifta, nil'el Rabbeinu Tam, ein mekadeshin anapat klal. Says Rabbeinu Tam, no, this is not how to understand the Gemara. You don't make kiddush over bread. You make kiddush over wine. V'hacha achi pilusho. So what does the Gemara mean? Hanotel yadav lo yekadesh, mishum desvir alei l'rav yesh kiddush shelo b'makom suda, v'chayshinan shema yaflig v'yelech lachutz. So he says the Gemara here is talking about something completely different. So to understand, he says Rav holds, this is not how we paskin practically, but we need to understand it, to understand what he did and see how this will affect our halach. Rav held that you do not need kiddush b'makom suda. You can make kiddush in one place and you can go somewhere else and eat your suda. Again, that is not what we hold, but that is how Rav held. And therefore he said like this. He said, if you're going to wash first, what's going to happen? He says, you're going to go somewhere else. Right? Zimnin dechaviv alei lifta, or mekadesh al lifta. And he says, what does it mean? Sometimes you make kiddush over bread. Meaning, klomar, v'mekadesh achamla, al da'at le'achom miyad lifta, v'ayad notel miyad yadav kodem kiddush. So that sometimes he would say kiddush over wine with the intention to eat bread, and then he would go and wash his hands after kiddush. And other times, on the top of the next page, zimnin dechaviv alei chamla, when he preferred wine, have a mekadesh achamla, shelo b'makom lifta. So he would say the bracha on the wine, not where the bread was. And he says this would all only work for somebody who has okay. So in other words, this is the explanation of Rabbeinu Tam. He says it's not. The point is, it's not that you can make kiddush over bread. The kiddush has to be made over the wine. There's a question here about whether there's going to be a hefsek. One goes to wash their hands and he's eating the bread in one place and the wine in another place. But that is, he says, kiddush needs to be over wine. Now, that's how Tosfot understands. Other Rishonim accept the simple meaning. The Rambam over here says the simple meaning of the Gemara that says that in theory, you could make kiddush over bread rather than over wine. That's more chaviv. Source number 20. The Rambam says, Ayamit avel apat yoter min hayayin, or shelo haya lo yayin. If a person wanted bread more than wine, or they didn't have wine, halei ze notel yadav tchila mevarech hamotzi umekadesh ve'achar kach botzeh ve'ochel. So he says, this is a scenario where you could make Kiddush over bread. You wash your hands, and then you say the bracha of Kiddush, and the bracha of Hamotzi, and then you eat. So that's the Rambam. Again, a number of Rishonim accept this reading of the Gemara, but the Rosh said, the Rosh says that this was an accepted practice. It says Nagua'am lekadesh alapat v'kem iskimu kol hageonim. Okay, this sounds very, very foreign to us. Maybe this may be that there was a time and there were places where you couldn't get wine, or wine was very expensive, and therefore they would make Kiddush over bread. Right? This is not our standard practice today. Says the Ramah, number 22. He says, if wine is available, you do not make Kiddush over. You do not make Kiddush over bread, and therefore that is the way that we. That is the way that we hold. If one does not have wine, again talking about Friday night, if one does not have wine available, then one could make Kiddush over bread. And the way you do that is you still have to say the bracha of Kiddush. So this might come up in the army and things like that, right? This is where it's more common, where there's no wine, but you have bread for the meal. So you would say the bracha of Kiddush over. You would wash, and you would say the bracha over the bread. Now,
because we have schnapps, if there's no wine in the house, is it preferable to say over Kiddush over bread, or should you say over schnapps and then say broth?
Right. So I think I think I saw this somewhere in here. I think it comes a bit later. Yeah, we'll probably only get to the sources of this next week. But essentially, we would make a distinction between the night and the day. And what most of the poskim would say is the following: at nighttime, if one does not have wine, so then for the nighttime Kiddush, you should say over the bread. For the daytime Kiddush, for the morning, if there's no wine available, it's going to be a problem to make Kiddush over the bread. Why? For the simple reason that what is Kiddush in the morning? Kiddush is brei bragafe. We're saying we're adding in a new, we're not saying a specific bracha over the Kiddush. So if I'm going to say my Kiddush over my bread, I can say im tashiv meshavat reglecha v'shamru, whatever I want, but it's inconsequential. It doesn't mean anything. All I'm doing is I'm saying the hamotzi lechem min haaretz, which I'd be saying hamotzi lechem min haaretz anyway over the bread. It's not recognizable that I'm doing the Kiddush. And therefore, most poskim say, in the daytime, schnapps, or again, we'll get to the complications of why maybe we should or shouldn't be doing that l'katrila. But if you have no wine available, so a different beverage to use to make Kiddush in the day, but at night it should be over the bread. That's the chalukah.
It'd be very particular to say each time if there is no wine available.
Yes.
Now, my impression is that in parts of northwest London there is wine available, but whiskey is the preferred drink, and therefore Kiddush in the day is made of the whiskey. Are you going to be dealing with that?
We're going to be dealing with that next week.
Yes.
Not necessarily with Northwest London, but with the okay. But just another point that comes up over this, and maybe with this we'll conclude, is assuming that we are making Kiddush over wine at night, wine or grape juice. By the way, that's a question I haven't yet raised. We'll discuss next week also. What about grape juice? Does grape juice have the same status as wine? Very, very interesting question. But assuming we are making Kiddush over wine, what about, should one wash first and then make Kiddush and then have bread? So have a look at source number 24. Source number 24 is the Shulchan Aruch. He says, Achar shekidesh al hakos, notel yadav umvalech al netilat yadayim. After you've made Kiddush over the cup of wine, you then wash your hands and say netilat yadayim. Ve'im natal yadav kodem Kiddush, gal leidate delifta chaviva le, lo yikadesh al hayayin ela al hapat. It says the Shulchan Aruch, you cannot, again, he's going like the Rambam and like the Rashbam and like many of the Rishonim in the Gemara that we saw, that says you cannot reverse the order. He says, when do you wash your hands? You wash your hands in order to eat bread. So if you've already washed your hands, that is a siman, you are showing that you want to eat bread. And therefore, by doing that, you've created a hefsek, or you've shown that the bread is more chaviv to you. And therefore, you can only wash your hands to then have the bread. So you could wash your hands and make Kiddush over the bread, but you can't wash your hands and then make Kiddush over the wine and then have the bread. That's the Shulchan Aruch. Now, the Ramah says differently. He says, Yesh omrim de lekatchila, yesh litol yadav kodem haKiddush ulekadesh al hayayin. There are those who say This is the minhag. Many yakas have this minhag still, right? That you wash your hands first. You first wash your hands. You say Antilat Yadayim. You then pick up the cup of wine. Again, if you're not accustomed to this, so you have to remind yourself not to speak and not to have a hefsek, and it can get very complicated. But if this is your minhag and you're used to it, so then it's okay. He says Yesh litoli adav kodem kiddush, and then you pick up the cup of wine and you say Kiddush and break bragafen and you drink the wine, and then you go straight into hamotzi. You've already washed your hands, right? V'chen haminhag pashut b'mdinot elu v'ein lashanot rak b'leil Pesach. Okay, says the Rama, that is the practice, that is the minhag in these parts, and the only time you should not do this is on Pesach night. Pesach is its own sugya, but that is the way to do it. So that is the minhag which exists in the Rama. The Mishnah Berurah, source number 25, says Kama achronim katvu detvadif lekatchila lekadesh alayayin kodem netilat yadayim. He says, okay, there are achronim, even achronei Ashkenaz, who say actually no, we should do it in the other way. We should do Kiddush first and then wash hands. That way you are yotze according to everybody. And in some places they follow this. It's interesting. You see from here, from the Rama and the Mishnah Berurah, that it seems to be that the more prevalent minhag in Ashkenaz was to wash first and then make Kiddush. Okay, so those are different minhagim which exist. And today, again, it says here, many Jews of German descent still follow the Rama. I know there are some places where they just switch on Sukkot because it's because more out of convenience than anything else, because it's difficult to go into the sukkah and then come back and then wash your hands. So there are people who have the minhag that then you wash your hands first and then you go in and make Kiddush. But as we've seen, that is a legitimate minhag. Again, the Rama didn't say it for convenience, and he didn't say do it on Sukkot, but he said you should do it every week except for Pesach. But those are the different minhagim, and one should still follow their practice. But that is where it comes from. It's all based on that Gemara with Rav, how we learned. Okay. Adkan, that's it for today. Next week, B'ezrat Hashem, will continue, volume 17, learning more about Kiddush. So a lot to talk about. Have a good day, everybody. Good week.
Shkoch, shkoch.
Yeah.
Several times we've been fanning thought out.